Welcome to the Water People podcast, where we talk story with some of the most adept waterfolk on the planet. I'm your host, Lauren Hill, joined by my partner, Dave Rastovich. For us, the podcast is a chance to dive into the aquatic experiences that really shape who we become back on land. This season is supported by Patagonia, whose purpose-driven mission is to use business to save our home planet. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge the Bundjalung Nation, the traditional custodians of the land and waters where we work and play, who have cared for this sea country for tens of thousands of years. Respect and gratitude to all First Nations people, including elders past, present, and emerging. Today we're in conversation with Louis Arnold and Chris Nelson, the minds behind the forthcoming film, The Big Sea. That's C as in S-E-A. The pair are known as, quote, stalwarts of the UK surf community, and their film is an exploration of the toxic nature of wetsuits, the true human cost of neoprene production, and surfing's links to Cancer Alley. In The Big Sea, Louis and Chris travel to Louisiana, where a company called Denka manufactures chloroprene, a material that we water people know as neoprene. The factory is in St. John, Louisiana, and it emits levels of chloroprene that the EPA has found to be carcinogenic. This 85-mile stretch along the Mississippi River is the site of 150 industrial plants, primarily fossil fuel and petrochemical operations. The result of this industrial density is toxic air pollution that has resulted in some of the highest cancer risk in the U.S., among other ailments, with the impact disproportionately impacting Black communities. This correlation between race and environmental hazard exposure is called environmental racism, a term that was first used by civil rights leader Dr. Benjamin F. Chavez Jr. He defined environmental racism as the intentional siting of polluting and waste facilities in communities primarily populated by people of color and low-income workers. As a result of exposure to industrial fumes, toxic dust, ash, soot, and other pollutants, these communities face increased risks of health problems like cancer and respiratory issues. While the numbers are a bit nebulous as yet, it seems as though most endemic surf brands have or continue to do business with Denka and are thus contributing to the suffering of the community nearby its factories. Their story is told in The Big Sea through the lived experiences of local environmental justice activists. While the film isn't available to screen yet, Chris and Louis are currently finalizing the edit. We got to watch an early draft of the film and applaud the team for their commitment to raising this uncomfortable conversation about where and how wetsuits are made and who is impacted along the way. A couple days ago, we'd just gotten back from a little trip overseas, and I was really excited to surf at home again. The sand bottom point breaks here just speak to my heart. And so I quickly grabbed my gear, threw everything in the car, got to the parking lot and realized that I had grabbed your wetsuit. And so I had to surf in this baggy, oversized clump of not neoprene, Ulex actually, exactly. Which brings us to today's podcast, all about the materials that make up the wetsuits that we wear.
Yeah, well, I'm really glad that happened to you. I wish I was there to see it because I've grabbed your wetsuit and hiked down trails and then gone to jump off rocks in the early cold morning and gone, I've got a size 8 women's suit. I squeezed into one of those and I don't think you could ever wear that one again after it, but
I felt like a little Grammy in yours.
Yeah, totally.
Wearing my dad's oversized wetsuit or something.
Yeah. And they're right now in such a great space, these natural rubber wetsuits. They're just so functional and feeling so great. And it was a work in progress for the last few years. There were some kinks to iron out. There was definitely just some issues with developing this tech and applying it in the ways that we are very specific about. You know, a surfer wants it to fit tight, but not too tight. You know, it's got to flex, but you don't want this baggy, saggy thing like you experienced the other day with the wrong size. we are really specific with how we want wetsuits to perform these days. Like we've all gotten very spoilt. Yesteryear, a few decades ago, it was a different story. And
it was woolen sweaters and denim and anything really to try and take the chill out of surfing in cold water.
But not anymore. We're very spoilt, and we have a standard that we all hold up. And so right now, though, these wetsuits just feel absolutely perfect and super springy, super warm, and also have a backstory that is more transparent and has, you would hope, a gentler footprint on the earth. I remember first connecting with Patagonia and going to Sri Lanka to look at some of the sourcing and the actual starting points for the things Patagonia was making then. So that
seeing rubber trees in Sri Lanka.
Yeah, so going to fair trade factories and watching how the fair trade system worked, but then also going to this tea and rubber location where there was rubber trees that had been tapped for the last 35 years, I think it was, without killing those trees. And people returning to those trees and doing so in a way that was ensuring those trees' lifespan. And anyway, that was my experience of going to see where Ulex comes from.
I think that's interesting because there have been critiques from the early screenings of this film, The Big C, people saying things like, that natural rubber maybe isn't the most sustainable alternative to chloroprene, to neoprene, and that monoculture cropping of natural rubber will present its own environmental challenges. And to that, I respond, those are great questions. And also it brings up in me the idea that maybe we shouldn't have a singular panacea solution to any of the major manufacturing problems moving forward. We should diversify instead of trying to think that one material can fill the niche for all of these uses, not just in surfing, but as in the podcast, we talk about how neoprene is used for all of these different uses.
Applications in the cars that we sit in every day.
Diving, waders. Yep. I think that's an important conversation to have. And before you were saying that our wetsuits have this backstory, they have this cultural evolution that we often don't think about, and they have an environmental and social cost that is generally hidden. And that's why we were so keen to sit down with the filmmakers here and talk about this, because it really does stretch across the global surfing community.
And to encourage more transparency right now. So it's like, look at our surfing organism. The surfing industry had a balloon period there, late 90s, early 2000s, where it was just growing off the hook. The companies were just absolutely flowing with money, and the bottom line was just not that low. It wasn't that much of a bottom line. It was real high, but at the cost of what and who. And so I think what we're living in right now, which is really wonderful, is that there is a genuine thirst from all of us in this modern world to know accurately what we're participating in when we hand over money to buy something. And if that is something that is clearly linked to harming people and or ecology, then hopefully there's a better way and there's a better choice, and we can make an informed choice that changes that situation. And the wetsuit one is really fascinating because we've all been so obsessed as surfers with surfboard design. We've all been just, head over heels about the wave riding instrument under our feet.
Oh, you especially.
Yeah, and though wetsuits for all of us, you're just stoked if it doesn't rash you on the nuts or under the armpits or around the neck. You're stoked if it keeps you warm and it's flexy. And we don't even think really beyond that. And so I think it's really admirable that these two wonderful gents from the Northern Hemisphere have dug into this and are now prompting quite a conversation, hopefully, that'll continue on.
There's also been a lot of silence from the surf industry, and I wanted to chat about that. Since we recorded this conversation, Wavelength magazine in Europe has since published a response from SEMA, the Surf Industry Manufacturing Association, their response to the film, to the idea of the film, because they hadn't actually seen the film. So they were responding theoretically to their ideas about the film. And then also the filmmakers then wrote a rebuttal to that response from SEMA. And I wanted to get your thoughts and reflections on those.
It seems like the hornet's nest has been stirred a little, and perhaps SEMA's first response to this is maybe not so measured and clear. There's a bit of a insensitive remark about people just having to be good at Wim Hof breathing and dealing with being in the cold if they want to have some sort of way to deal with the cold that isn't environmentally destructive or socially harming. And that's a bit of a lame statement when you're thinking about all of these people who are suffering in Cancer Alley in Louisiana there and the amount of struggle that's associated with neoprene.
We talk a lot in our conversation here about surfing and wetsuits, but what we didn't talk about as deeply is that this is really a film about cancer, about race, and about injustice, and the way those large global issues entwine with the decisions that we make as wetsuit-wearing surfers.
It's an interesting part of perhaps a larger movement of us having a good look at ourselves as a surfing organism, big community around the world. You've got things like surf colonialism, and we look at our impact in places around the world where surf ghettos have popped up, and it's questionable whether surfing has had a positive or a negative, a harmful or a wonderful impact on places and people. And this is another one of these areas that I think is really healthy for us to illuminate. And if you start to shine a light on it and look back at wetsuit history, you're looking back to basically a military-based product that came out of the States. You can
Specifically Southern California.
Yeah,
this is the lineage of white Western people taking beautiful Polynesian wave sliding and creating an industry around it.
Yeah, because it was a stoker, and they're all stoked people, and they're water people, they're divers and fishers and sailors and then surfers. So if we look at the really great book, The World in the Curl, An Unconventional History of Surfing by Peter Westwick and Peter Neuschel, those are two professors from Santa Barbara and who are lifelong surfers, and they've written quite an interesting story of surfing from their perspective.
We refer back to this book a lot.
Yeah, I really get a lot out of this book. And if we look into it, there's a section about America's military machine and its impact on surfing. And so we've got proximity of America's military, a lot of aviational work being done in Southern California. That's where people like Bob Simmons, who created planing hulls and the twin fin square tail boards of that era in San Diego area, who also then was one of the conduits for surfing to have foam and fiberglass and EPS, the same tech that we're using nearly 100 years later, which is a whole nother hornet's nest we should stir at a later point. But wetsuits came from this guy, and he was one of the central characters in developing the atom bomb. Bradner is his name, and it is Hugh Bradner, and he was a waterman. He was diving for abalone. He was a water polo and swimming sort of champ, tested scuba and the early type of scuba diving equipment. But he was entrenched in the military machine at that time, and most of the world was. It was between World War I, World War II. A lot of people were all wrapped up in that story. But he started to develop the wetsuit so that if you were an underwater commando dealing with explosives, if something blew up, your body would be contained in the wetsuit. It was blast impact. So it wasn't just about staying warm, it was also about blast impact. And then he and others helped develop what became the beaver tail wetsuit, which then came into surfing, which is a pretty classic nostalgic suit that every now and again some groovy people will wear at Malibu on a longboard. And that's where it's come from. And so I think I found that interesting because of the thinking that comes along with that. We look at where our surf industry's sort of central heart is, and it's Southern California, and it's potentially the children of those people who were living through war times, World War times, and maybe there's a thinking there that allows certain things to perhaps just slip through the cracks, and it's about keeping things going, keeping things alive, keeping businesses alive. The surf industry has been on the ropes for a long time now. Since that boom in the early 2000s, most companies have been sliding backwards, have been firing staff one after the other. And so I can see how something like, where do you get your rubber from for your wetsuits just sort of slips through the cracks. I know for me, when I was dealing with Billabong back in the day in that period, even when they were going crazy with money everywhere, most people were wearing like half a dozen hats in the offices there. Everyone was so overworked and so much could slip through the cracks. But that time is over. And I love what you've been saying, Lauren, about our surfing industry perhaps benefiting from sliding towards cottage industry qualities and diversifying and getting out of that multinational type of centralized way of thinking.
Yeah, the roots of surfing as an industry did start in the American military machine, like you said before. And it just reminds me that we live in a different world now. We know more. We have a better understanding of the way small decisions can have global impacts. We understand that climate change is happening and that as consumers, we can use our decisions to impact the way businesses choose or do not choose to move. And that can have, major impact, even if it's a small niche industry like surfing, which it is compared to, automotive manufacturing or something like that. But where I'm hopeful is in the fact that, yes, the surf industry is sort of eroding in a lot of ways. The big brands, I don't know, from what I can tell from young people, are being seen as less and less cool. And what's rising out of the ashes of those big brands are small, localized or sort of regionally appropriate or relevant brands. They aren't afraid to experiment with an alternative material like Ulex. I worked with Sia in the States for a number of years, and they've been making Ulex wetsuits for quite a number of years now, alongside Patagonia, who pioneered this Ulex technology in many ways. And what we're seeing is all of these little brands around the world who are run by surfers, for surfers, are starting to grow and I think have this sort of authenticity and coreness that the big brands just do not have anymore. They've been led astray by the dollar, really, by trying to appeal to the masses. And in the process, I think a lot of them have lost sight of what it means to be a surfer, how to connect with those of us who really do care about the whole experience of riding waves, not just an image.
Yeah. And I feel like in the documentary, there are a couple of locals there from that town that speak pretty much straight into the camera and speak to surfers saying, hey, if you're putting dollars in the pocket of Denka, then you're contributing to our suffering. And is it worth it? There's a moment there where they're saying you're a part of this, and we are. And so I feel that even that, when we get in there and start to get into the nitty-gritty, that's enough.
Yeah.
Whether it's Denka that's in Louisiana or their facilities in Japan, it's the one big beast who is being sued by the EPA, and individuals for the way they're treating that location and those people. This is not an admirable company that we want to be supporting as a community. So even that, to me, is enough of a kick up the bum, especially given we have another option, which feels fantastic. Even when you wear the wrong size and grab your partner's suit, you still probably were warm. Yeah. So I don't know. There's something in this where I guess there's going to be some tit for tat. There'll be some conversation, which is also awesome.
Yeah, that's what we've seen in the Wavelength series of articles. And how wonderful. We're actually talking about these things that 10 or 20 years ago, there wasn't room for this conversation. So yes, there will be semantics, there will be hairs split, but I agree with you. At the end of the day, if there's any chance that we're contributing to the suffering of a community, whether the particular chloroprene chips are coming from the direct facility in Cancer Alley, or if the chloroprene chips are coming from across the world, but still the money's going into the pocket that funds the Cancer Alley factory. Let's not do that. We know better. Let's do better. We've got great solutions. Let's just move forward.
Yeah. Well, I think from there, it'd be great to listen to this conversation and for people to tune in, chime in if there's any insights or anyone has any more info or intel around this issue, and to reach out to the filmmakers or just to the conduits in the surfing world that enable conversation to happen. I think we're all better off when there's more transparency and more honesty. Given how lucky we are to be surfers, we have enough spare time to go surfing. That means we have enough spare time to do the right thing as well.
We always begin the podcast in a similar place by asking about a pivotal moment. And since we're talking about The Big C, your new film forthcoming, can you tell us about the moment when each of you knew you had to act on the issue of wetsuit production?
Yeah, I'll jump in there. I just found out about the story through the reporting in The Guardian. I relayed that to some people in the surf media in Europe who I'd worked with over the years, with a view to those guys like using their platforms to cover it. If I generated some, like a photo essay or, a short film about it. And it was really the reluctance of these people who I'd worked with before, and I thought it would just be like a done deal that they would be into it. It was the fact that they like really sort of shied away from it and pretty much discouraged us from even looking into it. And that was, when I really thought this subject, this story needs to get out there. Like personally, I was just astounded. I'd never heard the word chloroprene. Like I've had wetsuits like all my life. Wetsuits are really important to us in the Northern Europe, North Sea, North Atlantic gets cold. We've had like loads of wetsuits. And, the fact that probably the main ingredient of the vast majority of those wetsuits that I've had have originated from this company, Denka. I was just astounded. I've worked in surf media. I just couldn't believe I hadn't heard this story. My background's in like photojournalism, and I've worked in mainstream newspapers in the UK for a long time. When people kind of don't want to run a story, that often indicates that it might be controversial, but it's something that really needs to get out there.
I jumped the gun a little bit, you guys. So we can establish your voices since people won't be able to see you. Would you mind both saying your full name and what your day job is?
Yeah. I'm Chris Nelson. I'm a writer and a filmmaker. I'm based in Cornwall. I'm also involved in the London Surf Film Festival, and my background has always been in surf media. So I've always been a surf journalist and a magazine editor, and have written scripts for documentary films and things like that.
My name's Lewis Arnold. I am a lifelong surfer from the northeast of England. I've had a career in photojournalism, and my sort of side job has been my personal work, which is surf photography, surf filmmaking. And about 5 years ago, I left my day job and I've made surf photography my full-time work. And working as the director on The Big C.
Like you said before, Lewis, the central thesis of the film is that the main ingredient in the majority of wetsuits, the wetsuits we all wear, for the most part, are directly causing the worst rates of cancer in America. Can you tell us what a wetsuit is made of?
Yeah, well, 98% of wetsuits are made from some form of chloroprene rubber. I think it's slightly higher, actually. I think like 1 to 2% of wetsuits are made of some form of natural rubber, but the vast majority are made of chloroprene rubber, whether that's from petroleum or whether it's from so-called limestone geoprene. Chris is more of a chemist. He could probably tell you the relationship between those two better, but around about half of a wetsuit is chloroprene. They're like little chips, almost like hash browns, they look like. And they're mixed with other components like carbon black usually, which gives it the black of colouring. Various other components, like your lining, your glues, they're like small parts of it. The main part is chloroprene. And, that technology hasn't really changed since I think it was invented in the 30s. This plant was opened in the late 60s by DuPont, and it's produced a lot of chloroprene rubber. I think I was just looking at some reports. I think they produce around about 6 million pounds of chloroprene a month.
Oh, wow.
And I wonder what percentage of that goes into the surf industry. Have you seen those numbers?
No, we haven't categorically seen those numbers, but the plant in Louisiana makes a polymer, which is basically the sort of grade of chloroprene that is designed for wetsuits. But there is a lot of uses for chloroprene and neoprene. like automotive industry, construction. But, as Denka say themselves, which is something that really sort of chimed for me, if you start looking into this, like Denka don't talk about making glue or hoses. They talk about making wetsuits. They kind of attach themselves to surfing to sort of, say, I think it's the words they use, we enrich people's lives through wetsuits made of neoprene, which shows our commitment to the environment. That's patently not the case, because of the environmental and social damage that they're doing through their production processes. I mean, Chris could probably add to the construction of wetsuits, but there's been a lot of developments in, for example, the lining of a wetsuit in like glues and solvents and threads. But, there's been very little by the majority of the surf industry, very little development of the main ingredient. Like, you can use natural rubber, but the take-up's been really sort of slow on that. And no one's really bothered to look for a cleaner, better alternative.
I'm curious, Chris, for your moment where you felt that call to go from observing this to actively pursuing this issue, that moment that changed you.
I heard through the grapevine that Lewis had gone to Louisiana, and I kind of heard the outline of the story, and I was really shocked about it, because I'd kind of I look back and I realized that basically through the work that I'd done, a lot of my work had revolved around the good that wetsuits had done. So, for example, when Jack O'Neill passed away, I wrote the film about his life. I wrote the script that was shown at his paddle outs and was released online. And I wrote a book about pioneers who had started surfing in cold places around the world. So like in Canada and Iceland and Hokkaido, and all that revolved around the wetsuits. And I'd never heard of this story. I'd never heard of chloroprene and what chloroprene rubber was. And when Lewis returned and he made this amazing short film about his trip there, and he sent it through to me to check out. And first of all, I was like blown away by the images, and there's like an industrial beauty to the landscape there. It's quite horrific and quite captivating. And Lewis and I had a conversation, and we kind of went, look, I think there's a feature documentary to be made here. And it was one of those moments where, people go, what about? Oh, well, if you're going to look at this, what about that? What about this? And the thing to stress about the film is this is like an independent film that the first trip that Lewis and I did back to Louisiana, we financed ourselves, so I sold a car, Lewis sold some lenses, we got on the flight and we went over there. And I think that's that thing that people talk about when they go, well, what difference can I make? And I think we both felt that this was such an important story that we were compelled, even though this is a story that revolves around like a Black community, and it's impacting, a minority low-income community. And we're like two white guys, relatively privileged white guys from the UK. I think we felt this was a story that we had to kind of bring to the world. And so, that was seeing Lewis's edit and feeling, we should be able to make this into a documentary feature that could actually make an impact and maybe change things, and that surfing could lead to that change.
Were you both really outraged and angry also as a starting point there with all of this? Did you feel like kind of betrayed and angry about this?
As I mentioned earlier, I was like, I kind of thought that the real villain, for want of a better word in this, was Denka. They're the ones who are like using surfing to like justify the production of chloroprene. And that was sort of the focus initially. But as I started working with Chris on it and we really dug into it, and, to get a more rounded approach to the whole story, we've spoken to a lot of surf industry, and it became apparent that, certainly over the last sort of 10 years, they've known about this, really chosen, probably for financial reasons, just not to do anything about it. And to actually, I think a lot of people are aware that it's coming. We're actually getting like more sort of criticism for raising this story. It is quite annoying. There's a lot of brands who really like boast about their environmental credentials, saying all their products are eco-conscious. You just got to look on their websites and at the marketing and all the language they use. And, it's not backed up. The bottom line is it's not backed up. They might be doing little things around the edges, but, they're doing business with a company, and a lot of business as well, who are getting sued by, it's not just me saying this is the facts. They're getting sued by the Environmental Protection Agency and the Justice Department. And there's like loads of civil cases. And they're not like holding their hands up, this company, they're fighting back. They are like saying like nothing to see here. This is just like a politically motivated, dreamt up, like basically saying all the residents, the campaigners living next to this place, suffering these shocking cancer rates, saying that they're lying and they're making it up and it's their own fault, and surfing is putting money in this company's pocket. And that's what, it's just, for me, that's like the antithesis of, what surfing should be about. I know it's out of sight. This isn't like a surf community there. I mean, they went up when we first went over, they were like, what's surfing got to do with these? They hadn't like connected it up. But to answer your question, yeah, I mean, I find it like an affront, really.
I think we were quite shocked, really, because I think we went into it quite hopeful because, as we always say, I think as surfers, we all think of ourselves as being environmentalists, and you think the people who run the brands have the same ethos that we do. And I think Lewis and I both felt when we start talking to the brands about this, they'll probably be shocked. They'll probably go, wow, we didn't realize we were doing business with this, multinational chemical company. Isn't that terrible? Let's move to make a change. But actually, what we've found through our conversations is some of the views are quite entrenched, and the brands put forward various excuses without actually offering to make any fundamental changes in the way that they operate. So I think that's one of the things the situation itself made us angry. And I feel like the response from the surf industry has also made us angry as well, because they could be doing a lot more and they could be leading a change away from this material.
Chris, I read your recent article in the new Wavelength magazine. I'd love to quote that back to you a little bit. You trace a strong historical lineage of the sort of environmental racism attached to the history of wetsuits. And in your article, you write about, quote, surfboards are getting short, hair is getting long, surfers are riding progressive new shapes, chloroprene rubber wetsuits are filling the lineups. In Hawaii, the legendary style master Jerry Lopez is exiting a thundering barrel at Pipeline, blasted by spray, emerging through the smoke of progress. And at the same time, in Louisiana, on the banks of the Mississippi, electrician and former musician Robert Taylor is standing on the front porch of his single-story brick house looking out over his lush green yard. Can you tell us about Robert Taylor, his lineage there, and his activism that's been part of your film?
Yeah. So Robert is one of the central protagonists for the film. His family have lived on that land for generations. And originally, most of the land along the banks of the Mississippi, which is now Cancer Alley, was slave plantations. They grew sugarcane. Because of the transport links, because it's quite rich land, there was a lot of land available. When the plantations closed down, these tracts of land were available, and the governor made the decision that he wanted to attract heavy industry. Now, some of the land had been sold to some of the slaves or the descendants of the slaves, because back then it was very hard for, the black community to purchase land. The credit wasn't available. And so land was made available via what was called sweat equity, where they basically could buy a tract of land and then build their own homes. And that's what Robert did. He built his own home on the banks of the Mississippi. And he was told, it was like the American dream, you can build your house and this will be your house for your ancestors, for your children's children, down through the generations. And then what happened to Robert was, he didn't know this, but basically the land next to where he lives, which was the Pontchartrain, which is now the Pontchartrain Works, which was the Belle Pont plantation, was sold to DuPont, which is now Denka. And that became this factory. So basically a factory opened up, a couple of blocks away from where he lived. And Robert grew up, obviously, in a time of segregation. He was originally he was a musician. You know, he was brought up as a child in an era when if they went into the shops and a white person was there, his mother would say to him, never look a white man in the eye and never look at a white woman, because there was the danger of lynchings. You know, that was Robert's childhood. And then he was brought up during segregation, where he was a musician and he would play on stage, but he would be segregated from the audience. And so Robert has lived this incredible life. I mean, his experiences that he talked to us about were are quite, you know, mind blowing, and so they are so informative. And then for him to be confronted by this powerful multinational corporation, you know, a lot of people would go, well, what can I do? But Robert has taken on that company, you know, and challenged that company. And he's now an 82, 83-year-old guy, and he's still fighting this company. And he's been to Japan to take on Denka. So Robert as a protagonist, his life story is incredible, and everything he speaks of is environmental racism. You know, these areas were chosen specifically because the communities around them were disenfranchised. They don't have political power. You know, they don't have the clout. You know, these factories would never be set up in, you know, Long Beach or Santa Barbara or anywhere like that, because they just would not be permitted, you know, or they would have been closed down decades ago. So,
and wasn't that true of the other factory in Kentucky in a white neighborhood?
Yeah. So the Rubbertown factory was closed down, whereas this factory is basically seems to be operating with impunity. And the other thing to raise, I think, is Denka aren't technically breaking any laws. You know, the EPA came out with a recommended level of emissions, and Denka have not broken any specific laws. They are the emissions that they produce are way above those levels, but they are still permitted to do this. And the EPA are having to basically fight them through the courts to try and establish a legal level of emissions to, you know, try and protect the local community.
Robert, he's been really important for us to try and get this story out there. He's had to become an activist, and he's actually become like a really good activist. Instead of like rolling over and taking this, you know, he's really taken the fight to initially to like a local level, regional level in government, not just the company themselves. You know, he's like had to explore and find out like every channel that's open to the residents there and get organized, you know, and he's done like an amazing job. And hopefully, you know, he will live to see a real difference. I've just got nothing but respect for Robert, really.
And this is personal for him, isn't it? His family have directly suffered from the toxicity of emissions in their community.
Yeah, I mean, like his granddaughter, his daughter, his daughters, his son, his wife. I mean, like he can't understand why he's still around, you know, but thankfully he is. And he's still, you know, like he is like an elderly gentleman now, but, you know, he's still like prepared to like work with us in scorching heat, trying to help us get what we need to make a, you know, a solid film on this. Things like, as Chris mentioned, like he flew over to Japan to confront the Denka shareholders. I think he's been twice, actually, you know, really going above and beyond. And really, he's become like a really respected campaigner, but which is quite amazing, really, considering he never wanted any of this, you know. But yeah, hopefully we'll do him justice in the film, and he's like a huge part of the whole campaign against chloroprene.
I'm curious about something you said earlier, Lewis. You said that Denka has defended their production methodologies because they say they're enriching people's lives because they're able to go surfing in cold water. And part of me thinks, well, that's not untrue. And also, lots of people have died, are suffering, are sick because of the same methodologies. Both are true, right? And so my question is, who's to blame here? Who do you point fingers at? Is it us for supporting the surf brands? Is it the surf brands for not being responsible with the information they've had about their raw materials? Is it Denka for providing the raw materials in the first place? Where do the fingers get pointed in your mind? And who should be first to step up and take responsibility?
I think surfers, as a consumer, a group of consumers, I think there has been a little bit of, well, there is just a sort of an acceptance of any sort of marketing that you're told. You can't really
we want to believe it. We want to believe it, don't we?
Yeah. I've bought a lot of wetsuits that have come from this place. That's the bottom line.
We all have. 98% of wetsuits, right, are made from chloroprene.
Yeah, petroleum-based, or this neoprene, which is supposedly limestone-based. It's still coming from Denka. And so I think consumers don't really, probably more so, I think probably getting a bit more clued up about looking into the sort of provenance of what you buy and, trying to make informed purchasing decisions. Whereas, in my early life as a surfer, I just, if it looked good and the surf mag said it was good, that was all I was bothered about, So, but I think that's changed. So I think the consumer to an extent, but if you don't know, it's quite hard, who's heard of chloroprene, I think the brands and the marketing strategies of brands has been damaging. Selling limestone neoprene as a greener alternative, as a greener way of doing it, when you still end up with chloroprene, exactly the same sort of chemical structure.
Chris, do you want to jump in and talk about that? I think that's a really important point that a lot of us have been duped into believing was a reality when in fact it, like the name neoprene, is just a marketing facade.
I mean, one of the interesting things is, obviously we're not experts, and so we've spoken to experts. And I think our job with the film is to try and present people with the facts as best we can and let people make an informed decision, because I think that's something that we've been denied over the years. Chemists that we've spoken to and material scientists have said, if anything, so-called limestone neoprene is worse for the environment than petrochemical chloroprene rubber. Because basically what you have to do is you have to quarry from the ground limestone, then you have to ship the limestone, then you have to melt it in a furnace to about 2000 degrees, and then eventually through a chemical process, you end up with chloroprene, which is the same substance that you get from petroleum. And then the chloroprene is, polymerized into chloroprene rubber. So chemically, there is absolutely no difference between limestone neoprene and petrochemical neoprene. And yet, for years, we've been told that limestone neoprene is, eco, it's ethical. I still see it now. There was a wetsuit guide came out in one of our surf magazines, a few weeks ago, and I was reading through it, and they're still using the terms eco and ethical to describe limestone neoprene. And I think the problem is that's such a headwind to change, because consumers have been told this, and they're choosing so-called limestone neoprene because they think they're making the, environmental and the ethical choice, and it's clearly not, and the other thing for us, aside from the chemistry of this, is you are still making a purchase ultimately from Denka. It's been sourced from Denka. So you're putting money into the pocket of a company that has a factory in Cancer Alley. So you are subsidizing basically a factory in Cancer Alley. So whether the chloroprene comes from the factory itself in Cancer Alley or from Japan, you're still dealing with the same company. And this is not a nice company. This company uses lobbyists. It uses, it spends a lot of money trying not to be environmental, trying to fight against, emissions controls and things like that. So the surf industry is not dealing with, I use the term nice industry, a nice company, but ultimately, these are the kind of comedy bad guys that you see in films, like The Dark Waters and things like that, where you see these companies and they're trying their best to avoid environmental regulations and things like that. So limestone neoprene really is a classic example of greenwashing, and I find it surprising. There are companies that we've spoken to and we've talked about this, and they've gone, yes, oh yeah, that's really terrible. And then these are the same companies that are still using that terminology in their adverts.
And now that we know better, we can do better. the hopeful part of this story is that the solutions are already available and on the market. And Ulex is one of those solutions. Patagonia makes wetsuits out of Ulex. There are other smaller brands who have been doing it for years. Can you talk about, that sort of hopeful part of the narrative?
I think this is the good thing about the film, is that it's not that we're making a documentary where we're going, look, it's all doom and gloom, what are we going to do as surfers? Because we all want to go surfing and we all want to be able to surf in cold water. We all need a wetsuit. But the good thing is that there is an alternative, and we have no vested interest here. We're independently funded, but the Ulex wetsuits are good. I mean, even brands that don't use Ulex are saying Ulex wetsuits are as good as chloroprene rubber wetsuits. So there is an alternative, and it's not just for uses, within surfing, because like we said, neoprene's used in many other industries, and natural rubber could be used in many of those applications. And I think, in other areas, people are looking at that. But within surfing itself, like you say, there are a few brands. I know that other brands are looking at Ulex. So for me, there's no reason not to make that switch.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in there, please, Lauren, because we are making this film independently. We are not funded or backed by, any brand. That said, researching this, we have learned quite a lot about natural rubber. And at present, it really is probably the only viable alternative to make a decent wetsuit, that's going to be comparable to the best neoprene wetsuit. Unfortunately, natural rubber has been, for whatever reason, the uptake hasn't been great. There's a perception of it being like not as flexible, expensive, when in reality, it's natural rubber's actually cheaper to produce. Somewhere along the line, the price is being artificially inflated. And that is why, earlier on I said like over 98% wetsuits aren't natural rubber. And that is probably, in my opinion, because the industry wants to keep it that way, because presumably there's more money to be made. There is another natural rubber coming out, I believe, or available for brands to use. So we'll see what the uptake on that is. Kind of like an alternative Ulex, I guess. But, Patagonia have kind of been at the forefront, pretty much backed the development of Ulex, but it didn't have to be that way. Other people could have done it. And, it's been and continues to be a struggle to compete against, the best neoprene wetsuits, which, brands seem to be, and the manufacturers seem to be more intent on developing neoprene wetsuits to be better and better and stretchier than developing a really good natural rubber wetsuit or something else. So yeah, I mean, it's the independence that I wanted to stress. That is an accusation we get. It's like, oh, you're just wanting to sell Ulex wetsuits. It's like, sometimes I wish we were funded by a brand because it's been a real struggle. But, the benefit of doing it independently is that we've got like editorial integrity and everything we say is backed up and, that's a strength. Like we're getting people like making accusations against us who haven't seen the film. Like the version you've seen is a test screening, so that's not going to be, but, people seem to be able to like draw conclusions about us that are just false.
Please stay tuned while we take a quick break to acknowledge the folks who help make our podcast possible.
If the first 50 years were an experiment
to prove that a business could be
responsible
and successful,
turns out it's not just possible,
it's profitable.
So what's next?
What's next is simple. It's human-powered, and it's finding the joy in doing difficult things.
What's next is turning capitalism on its head
and putting all our money where our mouth is.
What's next is unstoppable.
Thanks to Patagonia for their continued support this season and for prioritizing purpose over profit to protect our wondrous planet, our only home. Born on the back streets of Byron Bay, Stone and Wood is a certified B Corp started by three mates who wanted to make a beer business with a difference, a brewery for the community. Through their ingrained foundation, Stone and Wood donates money and volunteer hours directly to the communities where they work and live, focusing on the environment and social causes at a grassroots level. Thanks for your support this season, Stone and Wood, and thanks for giving back to our community here on the Northern Rivers. Learn more at stoneandwood.com.au.
I'm curious to know if there is, in the final edit of what you all will share with the public, if you will be putting, like a pretty straightforward call to action out at the end on screen in some way with this. I think we live in an interesting time where we had the era of expose, social and ecological documentaries coming out, say, since the 2000s, things like Inconvenient Truth and 11th Hour and all those sort of things, The Cove, shocking sort of films. And I feel like last few years we've moved into an area where we do that when we see popular expose films come out, but we also ensure that there are solutions and options moving forward really available for people to leave the theatre with or to pass on to their friends or whatever. I'm just interested in what your strategy around that is and how you are navigating that space at the end of the film, what people will walk out with.
One of the things that we learned from the test screenings that we did, and we did a few test screenings to support our crowdfunder to help finance the film, was that Lewis and I were present at all the screenings and we did Q&As with the audience at the end. And we were asked the same questions time and time again. So it helped us reinforce areas of the film that people needed to know a bit more about. But also, people left the screenings. They really wanted to make and then people emailed us afterwards and they said, I've just bought a new wetsuit and I haven't worn it and I've sent it back and I've ordered a Ulex wetsuit. And not only that, I've written to the brand and I told them why I'm making the change. And I think the number of people that did that just from the few screenings that we did does show you the power, I think, that the film has to make a difference. Because I think people do feel like they haven't been told the truth, and I think people do feel like trying to make ecological and ethical purchasing decisions, and that once they are presented with the facts, then they feel empowered to go away and say, this is wrong. I didn't know that. I'm making a change. And I think you're right, Dave, that it is good that there is an alternative available for people to make the change. But I also think that brands need to make those products available for people, because there are only a few brands that are utilizing natural rubber, but it is widely available and there is enough out there to allow brands to make the switch. So there is, the natural rubber industry is actually quite a huge industry. It's almost about the same size as the neoprene industry. So there is the natural rubber available. The brands can make the switch, and I feel like the brands have to meet the consumer halfway and make the products available. And I think that's one of the things that I found frustrating, just circling back a little bit to the kind of limestone neoprene and the greenwashing angle, is that, products that are labeled as green and ethical have been sold on carbon emissions, and I still see that now, and I still read that about Ulex and limestone neoprene, and they're still trying to sell the products solely on carbon emissions. And I think the consumer looks at that issue and they think, I can kick that into the long grass. It doesn't really matter if I buy a wetsuit that has more carbon emissions. And I think the brands need to grasp this subject and they need to talk about it, and they need to be straight with the consumer and say, chloroprene rubber is not something we should be utilizing. It's toxic, it's a carcinogen, the emissions are basically killing people in Cancer Alley,
It's not worth it when we have a viable alternative.
And I think the brands need to be upfront about that. And I think one of the things that surfing has always been like a boys' club. And I think a lot of the people that work in the industry You know, they work at different brands, but they're all mates. They go surfing together. You know, they're basically predominantly white males who've all been friends for a long time. They go to trade shows, they have beers together. And I think that has been a headwind in people putting their hands up and saying, we need to make a change. Have you looked at this subject? Because it's an unpopular subject. Nobody really wants to talk about, you know, pollution and people getting cancer as a result of, you know, chloroprene production. Like, nobody wants to be the guy who says that, you know, and I think that's where the surf industry is lagging behind other areas, because it's archaic, you know. We're lagging behind, you know, the automotive industry and, you know, manufacturing of computers and other products. You know, it needs to make the change, and people need to be brave enough to put their hands up and start talking about this as a subject.
What percentage of the surf apparel industry does wetsuit sales make up? How big of a part of the surf brands' pockets are we talking about disrupting here?
It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. Yeah. But
no,
I think
sorry, I was just going to say, I would like to dig in here because I get really pissed off about the surfing industry branch of the surfing organism. And I feel like there is so much bullshit and there is so much spin and there is so much nepotism and sexism. There's just so many issues going on when it comes to the industry. And when we look at it right now, the state it's in, it's been struggling and on the ropes for the last 10 years. So when you all were saying earlier that, you know, say we've known about this issue for the last 10 years, if you're someone involved in the industry, the last 10 years for the industry has been such a struggle. And I know from having different friends and people within the surfing industry who have jobs in all different levels, they've pretty much been all terrified that they're about to have no job and they don't have any other skills, and what are they going to do? So of course those individuals within the system are just scared to do anything that might jeopardize what's already at risk for them. And when we see the way the corporate structure of it is going, where you've got the board riders conglomerate that rules Quicksilver and Billabong and whoever else they own these days, and I guess the disillusionment in surfing with those brands, like, this is a very dynamic time, and it seems as though an expose like this is perfectly suited to this moment where we're looking at all of it, warts and all, and realizing, holy shit, we have a lot of warts. We have a lot to take care of when it comes to this part of the surfing organism. And do you feel, I know you've said there's frustrations and you feel that there's been a letdown with the response from, I guess, media outlets and surf companies. But do you feel like the brands, the companies like Finisterre, say the Patagonias, and smaller groups that are out there in the world, I know Need Essentials here in Oz have pursued Ulex.
Sia in California,
yeah, exactly. That there's a real light there among the depopularizing of the big multinational corpo beast of those companies in surfing, and a real popularization of these smaller ones, that is a part of how we can solve this problem.
Like a decentralization of surfing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm no businessman, as you probably are aware. But
yeah, that's right. If you're in surf photography, then that's definitely true.
Yeah. Yeah, tell us about it. But, you know, I think it's the corporate, like the structure of these newer companies that you're alluding to there, you know, they're sort of smaller, so they're a little bit more agile. They're probably not as shareholder driven. You know, like shareholders in big companies, they don't care what the company's doing as long as they get their dividends, you know. And if that's the sort of disconnect that I think those big brands have, you know, they've kind of forgotten their roots, haven't they? If that's what they're into, just making money for shareholders. And you know, we've spoken to people who work there, and they just said, yeah, we'd like to make a change, but the bean counters won't let us. You know, there's this thing where brands might have, like, I don't know, say they've got like 40 wetsuits that they make, and they're all neoprene, but then they'll do one, what they'll call it a green wetsuit made of natural rubber. And it's kind of just like that sort of, ticking a tick box exercise to say, oh, well, we're doing our bit. We've got a green alternative. We don't really want you to buy it because we make more money off the other ones. And if we say natural rubber is really good, then, who's going to buy the main stock? So weirdly, this could be like a really good opportunity for one of those big brands to like sort their act out, quite frankly, and, make like a really good natural rubber wetsuit. They put out this sort of perception that natural rubber doesn't perform as well. It's not as stretchy, like if you want to, do real high level performance surfing, then natural rubber is not going to be the thing for you.
I mean, we can talk about that too. Dave's been wearing Ulex for years. I've been wearing Ulex for years. How's it for you?
Yeah, I still do the one turn that I've always done perfectly the same.
Yeah. Well, it's just a total red herring. That criticism,
totally.
That if you make a wetsuit super stretchy, it just like it's the elasticity is so great that it will never stretch back. Do you know what I mean? It's just not durable. And also make like the stretchiest neoprene. The only time you need that stretch is like when you're putting it on, and even then you don't need it. Like when you're surfing, you don't actually sort of utilize the stretchy, like that real sort of flex that the material could do. But I just think, it's perception, like kids want the equipment that the top pros are wearing. That's sort of how the marketing seems to work. And I just think it's a shame that, we've been told that the pros often wear natural rubber and compete wearing natural rubber. And I was just astounded that that's not like something the industry market on the back of.
Totally.
They're just like, I was amazed, but that's how they're running the company. And it indicates to me that it's because they don't want anything to change. It's like entrenched, sort of well-furrowed business setup structure. That's how it's been. That's how we make our money, and we don't want to change.
I've always found it really tricky to insert social or ecological issues into surf media because of it being such a escapist realm. We watch surf films, we open the mags to escape the rest of the world, and a lot of us surf for those reasons too. And it is a tricky line to dance here, and you can see how well you navigate that in the film, where you have the juxtaposition, which I enjoyed actually, of hearing these southern voices. And there's that one in particular which sounds like an older woman. You never see her face, I don't think, but you hear her talking. She sounds like she's really close to the microphone and speaking so beautifully and gently over the top of other, imagery like surfing, and it looks like it's up in your neck of the woods. And I'm just interested in that. How did you get to that part of the filmmaking process where you decided on how to marry those two worlds, how much of one you can have without the other, and just how you went through that process?
Yeah, I mean, that's been brought up before. It's just really a simple sort of technique. When I was first making this film, I was studying like how surf photography, still and moving image, can be used to communicate issues that have got a wider relevance than just that's a cool wave or look at that turn, Often mainstream industry sort of dips into surfing to sort of give itself some sort of cool, and that's what sort of inspired us to look into that. And so I was working out how you can use surf imagery to talk about wider issues, basically. One way you can do that is just do things that aren't often done before. So when you just juxtapose someone talking about cancer with some dreamy surf footage, because it's not what you normally hear, it sort of gets your attention a bit more as a viewer, hopefully. So that's like a sort of a technique, a structure in the film, which kind of works. We think we've adopted it in the film. I mean, it is a documentary, but I don't want it to feel like a documentary, I think I want to sort of retain some of the creative elements you get in surf photography and surf filmmaking. And it's still a surf film, but hopefully it's like moving surf films on a little bit, where it's getting beyond going on a surf trip, just looking at the beautiful side of surfing. hopefully it's like a bit more real. Everyone's probably been aware that wetsuits aren't the most environmentally sound product. You could say the same with boards, I guess, but but hopefully people have got the sort of bandwidth to deal with that and take a film that looks into that, you know. I mean, people are pretty sophisticated viewers of media these days, you know. I believe people can take bad news, you know. We've had like COVID, wars, there's injustice all over the place. And pretend it's not happening is just not a very real way of looking at life, is it?
One of the great strengths of the film is that you're not really asking that much of people. You're saying, these are the facts. Here's a viable alternative that performs just as well. It's available on the market. It already exists. When you go to buy your wetsuit every year, every second year, every fifth year, maybe make a better choice next time. Here's the choice. There are lots of options. You know, it's not that big of a leap, I don't think, and I loved that about the film.
You know, the film is there's a lot of issues going on in this story, and the film tries to reflect that. You know, it is about cancer. It is about race. It is about injustice. It is about, you know, devastating effects of like wanton capitalism, essentially. You know, it's like, how has this been allowed to happen? It's over like hundreds of years of injustice that this is deemed to be an acceptable thing to happen today.
Well, it's a deconstruction of privilege, isn't it?
Yeah, obviously we haven't got the answers to all that, but it is quite, you know, making it's felt quite like a weighty job to take on, you know. And as it's starting to come out, you know, it's like, just hope we've done justice to, first and foremost, to the campaigners there, you know. Like they want us to tell this story to an audience where they can't reach. So we just hope we've done them justice on it.
If I could just pick up a little bit on the structure of the film, because, you know, it's one of the things that Lewis and I talked about a lot, how we were going to tell the story of because obviously the central thing is the campaigners and the community. And, you know, it's like an onion. There's so many layers to the story. But the people who tell the story are the protagonists of the community. Like, there's no voiceover, there's no narrator to tell the story. It's all the lived experience of the community there. And then we bring in people from, you know, the surfing world, you know, so we do bring in surfers, but we also bring in, so for the new edit, we have a chemist to bring in who's a surfer. We have an oncologist to bring in who's a surfer. So it's like the people who are telling you the story are either the community themselves or people who are linked to the surf community, you know. So it's not us telling you the story. The story comes from the people who are immersed in this subject.
You do that really well. I really enjoyed that. I really thought that was refreshing and really intimate take on things. I really appreciated that. And I know it's a tricky line.
It was a very sobering experience to, you know, to go to Cancer Alley, to go to Reserve and St. John's Parish, and to go and meet with the community. And they invite you into their homes, and, you know, you sit down on their sofa and they tell you the stories of how they've been impacted by this pollution, you know, and these emissions from the plant. And for someone to tell you that they've lost parents and siblings and children, you know, all in one family, and then to walk out into the street and to point out all the houses in that street, and to basically point at every single house and say, this house had cancer, that house had cancer, they have cancer, that person died of cancer. You know, it just completely changes your whole life. And then when you leave the community, you know, you want to take that and be able to communicate that to everybody, you know, because you think so many news crews have gone and covered this as a story. You know, it's been on CBS, it's been on NBC, it's been on Fox News. The Guardian did an expose, and the people in the community have you know, spoken to journalists over the years, and nothing has changed, you know. And I think Lewis and I both felt like when we left, we wanted there to be a change, even if that change was surfing moved away from this and was like the first industry to put its hand up and say, we shouldn't be using chloroprene rubber, you know. And then hopefully maybe other industries will then go, oh, well, why is surfing doing this, you know? Because neoprene's used in cycling, it's used in fishing for waders, you know. It's used in so many other, like in sneakers, in outdoor wear. And if surfing were to put its hand up and actually say, we're not using chloroprene rubber anymore, hopefully those industries will follow, and then that will make a change. And, ultimately the plant at Denka will have to make a change. Either it closes down or it has to, cut down its emissions to a level where it doesn't impact the community.
Well, surfing's certainly better off for having this film a part of our community now, and it's going to be amazing to watch what happens as this circulates and seeing how people respond rather than just the corporates. And Lauren?
I wanted to ask you about that, Chris, in the test screenings. What has the disparity been between community response, media response, and brand response? I know, maybe certainly not as many people have seen the film yet as will see the film soon enough when you release it, but have you felt that gap?
Weirdly, our feeling was the people who came, the overwhelming response we got was people wanted to make a change. We did all the screenings, we did a show of hands, and we said, how many people would buy a chloroprene rubber wetsuit after watching this film? And not a single person at any of the screenings put their hands up. And we even had reps from brands, we had marketing managers from brands came to see the film. The response we got from them was, the industry needs to make a change. So I think, Dave, it's something in what you said in that people, I think, are afraid to put their hands up and say, within the corporate structure, this needs to change. Have you seen this? Have we thought about this? How do we as a company respond? So I think from the consumer, from the surfer, the response has been overwhelmingly positive. I think from the media, I've been disappointed by, a lot of the response we've had from the media. I think the media, for whatever reason, have been afraid to touch on this subject. And I think either are ignoring it or want to wait to see how this plays out before they basically, get involved.
It's pretty straightforward, that one, though, isn't it? Because it's like if you're a little media house that is essentially the surf industry, a part of the surf industry that requires ad money from the companies that are happy to keep selling chloroprene, then they're not going to risk that, are they? They're on the ropes too.
Yeah. I think in a way that they've even been scared to come to the preview screenings.
That's
we've
just so crazy. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So magazine editors haven't been to screenings that we've invited them to. Even we've kind of said, look, I understand you're in a difficult position, but why don't you just come and see the film? And
that's so odd.
And at least So I think this really has shown for me the surf industry really is quite dysfunctional at the moment. And I think it really needs to look at itself and say, how do we address things if something's not right? How do we, as a company or as a culture, as a community of brands, how are we able to discuss things?
What's the production schedule looking like, Chris? When can everyone have a look at your beautiful film?
So we're aiming to have the film finished for kind of the beginning of the autumn, and then we're going to roll out screenings globally. So we're going to be doing film festivals. So film festivals, adventure film festivals, documentary film festivals, surf film festivals, and we're going to be getting the film out to as many people as possible. So hopefully people can come along and see for themselves and make their own decisions. Like I say, we're not telling people the choices to make. We're just basically trying to get the facts out there. And I think if people disagree, then we're really happy to enter into that discussion with people, because I think that's one of the interesting things. I think over 3 years of doing this, we've learned a lot about, and I never thought I ever would be delving into the production of chloroprene, there's into chemistry, into supply chains, into all these things, and at times we spoke to people from brands and they were asking us questions about their supply chains, which I found quite mind-blowing. That someone who works for a multinational surf brand would be saying, okay, so we actually buy our products from this company. All right, okay, and you go, but that's your job. So
Yeah, like you said, that's the dysfunctional nature of the surf industry at this point in time. And as people who have, got relationships with other surfers who are in these companies that are wearing like 10 different hats and are just hanging on by a thread and have been for years, it's quite easy to see that when you actually look at the individuals, the humans within these structures, that those specific people are not bad people. They're just really overworked, stressed and scared about how they're going to look after their own personal family unit when this one job they've had for quite a few years is right on that edge and everyone's getting cut and every company's being consumed. It's a very tricky time.
It's not the people, it's the system.
Yeah.
It's the systemic structure that allows us to be so fundamentally disconnected from a supply chain, even if we're the one, constructing a garment, that we can be so disconnected from the production of a material that is literally killing generations of people for our, simple surfing pleasure.
Leisure, yeah. It makes me wonder, Chris, about the idea, and I think you mentioned this earlier, of surfers being kind of environmentally sensitive and the letdown of that I think a lot of us over the decades, if we've had an interest in that, have felt that it is rather hard to motivate the masses when it comes to surfers giving a shit in one way or another. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts around that now that you've had these last 3 years. Are we expecting too much of each other simply because we surf?
I mean, I'm hoping that what will happen is there will be a lot of people who are motivated by the human impact of this and will hear the stories and say, I'm going to make a change. And then I think there will be people who maybe, will try and ignore it, but maybe will make a change because brands are offering an alternative that is as good as what they're currently purchasing, because that can happen. I think the Ulex wetsuits that are on sale now, I've been surfing in Ulex wetsuits for the past couple of years, and if I put this on and I was not told that it was Ulex, I would think it was a neoprene wetsuit. It's just as stretchy, it's just as it's long lasting, they're great. So I think there's also that element of offering people an alternative that they can just make the choice as consumers, and they're not sacrificing anything. But at the same time, it is making a difference to these people's lives. So yeah, I think for me, this could be a no-brainer, which is why I find it frustrating and difficult that, there's not been more movement already. I hoped that as brands heard a little bit about the film and they started to look into it themselves, they might say, we need to get ahead of this. We can see what's coming. Let's start making the change. Maybe start the shift away from, chloroprene rubber. So I've been a little bit frustrated that hasn't happened, but hopefully with more consumer pressure, then it will.
Thanks so much for listening with us today. If you like what you heard, please consider sharing an episode with a friend. Our editor this season is the multi-talented Ben Alexander. The podcast soundtrack was composed by Shannon Sol Carroll, with additional tunes by Dave and Ben. We'll be continuing today's conversation on Instagram, where we're at Water People Podcasts, and you can subscribe to our very infrequent newsletter to get book recommendations, questions we're pondering, behind-the-scenes glimpses into recording the podcast, and more via our website, waterpeoplepodcasts.com.